Right, so following on from the arrest and detention of journalists Richard Medhurst and Sarah Wilkinson, a third prominent, and it has to be said, non-mainstream journalist has been targeted by the police under, frankly, the abuse of counterterrorism laws. The real crime, of course, of writing about what Israel have been doing, are still doing, and holding them to account in a manner that the Zionist without qualification leading this country right now and becoming ever more unpopular at a rate of knots as he is doing so, Keir Starmer, doesn't like it. The targeting of journalists writing about the truth of matters in the Middle East based here in the UK since Starmer took over PM was just pretty much beyond doubt in the minds of most people. Therefore, perhaps it's no surprise that Electronic Intifada associate editor and author Asa Winstanley has had his home raided by the police and all of his electronic equipment seized, though has not at this time been arrested. Journalism is not a crime. But Keir Starmer is trying his damnedest to make real journalism to deliver the truth, to hold power to account, to oppose fascism, into a crime. He's trying to cow independent media and alternative media into silence. But that's the thing with journalism with integrity. The integrity bit matters more. And therefore his authoritarianism here will fail. It must fail. And every journalist he targets will basically have a badge of honour slapped on them saying this person says important things and we should listen to them more, not less. Right, so I dare say Keir Starmer does have a warped sense of journalism. This is evidently what he thinks passes for it, fawning sycophancy for tasty titbits and nonsensical scoops. But this is nothing of the sort. These people represent grossly overpaid dross, stenography, writing what he says and passing it off as news, mind-numbing drivel, unchallenged to dumb down the populace. It is what mainstream media and their media baron billionaire bosses have done for decades quite successfully. But now we live in an era of social media, an era of people being able to become journalists from their living rooms pretty much, and no longer needing to be born into a silver spoon family to be able to get a leg up on the media ladder, whose families could support them whilst they spent years as unpaid interns at various newspapers. And you know what? It's a good thing too. It means power is getting held to account by media startups that go from strength to strength, from Squawk Box to Vox Political to Novara Media, Electronic Intifada, Evolve Politics, and more and more. And this has given rise to an army of far better informed activists. And the more media sources you read, the better you can formulate your own opinions based on that. Foreign media too. And that in turn gives rise to people like me, who giving us plenty to talk about, people for whom the mainstream media is too much of a pro-establishment force, now challenged by others spreading more of the truth and telling the stories they refuse to and breaking that connection between them and the political classes who are far too close to each other. Alternative media has become a real threat to the status quo, and therefore all of those independent journalists have become bigger and bigger thorns in the side of people who would quite like things to stay just as they are. And when they might have grumbled about that previously, now an authoritarian and ardent Zionist like Keir Starmer is running the country, all of a sudden these alternative media voices and independent journalists, and notably it has been specifically when it comes to Israel at that, all of a sudden indie media journalists are being targeted and accused of criminal acts. But the only criminal act they're actually guilty of is telling the truth about the Israeli regime, the fascist, genocidal apartheid state that it is run by a madman and an even madder hard-right administration, but a state that has far too much influence over ours as well, and our leaders. Being pro-Palestine and anti-Israel and reporting on that is, it seems, a crime now in Starmer's Britain. We've seen Middle East independent journalist Richard Medhurst arrested, a man whose parents won Nobel Prizes for their humanitarian work in the Middle East, who knows his onions. He was brought up on it, and yet was arrested and accused of terrorism. We saw the same thing happen to another journalist, Sarah Wilkinson, arrested at her home, all her electronic equipment seized. Again, the accusation was she was supporting terrorism, when what she does is document and chronicle the plight of the Palestinian people under the Israeli regime. And now again, under the auspices of counterterrorism, the police have now raided the home of Electronic Intifada associate editor Asa Winstanley. Winstanley is, in my view, one of the most prominent, informative and talented investigative journalists in the UK today. And his experience and personal knowledge of the Middle East, particularly Israel and Palestine, is exemplary. He's been going out there since 2004. And again, it's the common denominator when you consider Medhurst and Wilkinson too. It's counter-terrorism laws being used against pro-Palestine journalism. Being pro-Palestine is now the crime. Well, as you might imagine, Winstanley's own publication, Electronic Intifada, has indeed covered this story. Here's an excerpt. British counterterrorism police on Thursday raided the home and seized several electronic devices belonging to the Electronic Intifada's associate editor, Asa Winstanley. Approximately 10 officers arrived at Winstanley's North London home before 6 a.m. and served the journalist with warrants and other papers authorising them to search his house and vehicle for devices and documents. A letter addressed to Winstanley from the Counter-Terrorism Command of the Metropolitan Police Service indicates that the authorities are aware of your profession as a journalist, but that notwithstanding, police are investigating possible offences under Sections 1 and 2 of the Terrorism Act 2006. These provisions set out the purported offence of encouragement of terrorism. An officer conducting Thursday's raid informed Winstanley that the investigation was connected with the journalist's social media posts. Attempts to reach the Metropolitan Police Service for comment for this story have been unsuccessful. Although his devices were seized, Winstanley was not arrested and has not been charged with any offence. So let's break this down a moment then. Counter-Terrorism Command had a warrant to search Winstanley's home and take his electronics, and it's to do with possible offences under Sections 1 and 2 of the Terrorism Act in relation to encouragement of terrorism. So let's start with that. This part of the Act, as far as causing an offence, reads, a person commits an offence if A, he publishes a statement to which this section applies or causes another to publish such a statement, and B, at the time he publishes it or causes it to be published, he intends members of the public to be directly or indirectly encouraged or otherwise induced by the statement to commit, prepare, or instigate acts of terrorism or convention offences, or is reckless as to whether members of the public will be directly or indirectly encouraged or otherwise induced by the statement to commit, prepare, or instigate such acts or offences. This is very open to interpretation, but has apparently been cited in relation to Winstanley's social media posts. To be guilty, he has to have induced or encouraged someone to commit an act of terrorism, and this is all, as the police told Asa, despite the knowledge they had of his profession. Well, I'll have a look at Winstanley's own tweets for the week leading up to this incident, just as a for instance, just to get an idea of what he's been saying that they might have construed as incitement of terrorism, and there is, of course, absolutely nothing there, except, as you might expect, an emphasis on Israel and their conduct. He's discussed the Hannibal directive instigated by Israel against its own people on October 7th. He's posted about the electronic Intifada live stream. He spoke about a German novelist saying comparisons of Jewish deaths during World War II at German hands and the killing of Palestinian children at Israeli hands is a blood libel. He's posted images that many of us have seen already of the victims of the fires at the Al-Aqsa hospital this week, struck by Israel. He spoke of Iran's strike on Israel, only striking military targets. He congratulated David Miller on his legal case win, which now makes anti-Zionism a protected political belief. He has slammed the double standards and rhetoric used by many mainstream media outlets when talking about Palestinian or Israeli casualties. He talked about the Palestinian struggle under occupation being a resistance, and whether you agree with the methods possibly employed, they are protected under international law. Winstanley has said absolutely nothing that I can see, as expected, that remotely resembles anything advocating for people to commit acts of terrorism. He isn't telling people how to make explosives. He isn't pointing out potential targets. He's doing his job of a journalist. And his home's been raided for it, and he's the third prominent alternative media journalist to be targeted by the UK for basically reporting from a pro-Palestine perspective. That's his only crime. It is little wonder that human rights groups and activists consider the Terrorism Act of 2006 to be an appallingly badly drafted and open to abuse piece of legislation, which is now in the hands of a Prime Minister long considered to be a little better than a security state asset, as well as an avowedly pro-Israel one. It is fascism being meted out against people speaking out for the oppression or for the oppressed when the government of the day is so in hock to the whims of the oppressor. Well, it won't work. Quite simply, the likes of Richard Medhurst, Sarah Wilkinson, Asa Winstanley, and others who have been targeted by the state previously, like Craig Murray or Kit Clarenberg, will continue to do what they do, because it's more than a job. Journalism is a vocation. It's an honourable profession, the honourable profession. And their dedication to the truth, to social justice, to holding power to account, shows what journalism truly is and is supposed to be, and it inspires many more of us to do our bit as well. Equally, those of us who amplify their work, cite them as reliable sources that we stake our own reputations on as commentators, will continue to uphold their work as the highest standard of real journalism, in stark contrast to obsequious butt-kissing seen by supposed journalists working for supposedly trustworthy, but all too mainstream and far too establishment-friendly sources. I stand by Asa Winstanley without a single doubt in my mind, solidarity, my friend. A donation to Electronic Intifada would be a fine way, I fancy, to show your support and flip the bird to Starmer and his police state proclivities, in my opinion. So, how about it? Meanwhile, if you're less familiar with Sarah Wilkinson than perhaps you might be with Richard Medhurst or Asa Winstanley, find out a bit more about her and her arrest in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next video. Cheers, folks.